Okay, I'd like to welcome everyone back, including our online audience, for our 1 o'clock session. We're just got the afternoon left here, and Genocide Awareness Week will be done here on the ASU campus, but we again have an event tomorrow evening at Scottsdale Community College in collaboration with them and the local Armenian community, St. Apgar Apostolic Church. And I'm honored to have an honorary guest here, a dignitary, who will be introducing our panelists and saying some words before those introductions. We have Vartan Arabian, the Honorary Consul of the Republic of Armenia for Arizona here, to whom I'm going to hand the mic. And we're really honored to have you here and look forward to your announcement, proclamation, and introduction. So it's an honor and just
thank you. Honored mine.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. It's truly an honor to be here today. First, I'd like to extend our sincere gratitude to Dr. Timothy Langell. All right. The head organizer of Genocide Awareness Week, and St. Apgar for making this happen today. I want to thank Dr. Langell. I want to thank you for your leadership, your dedication, and for the creation of a space where education, reflection, and truth can come together in such a meaningful way. We also want to recognize all of the speakers and guests who have taken the time to be here. Your voices, your perspectives, and your commitment to remembrance and awareness are what makes this week so impactful. We are especially honored to be joined by two distinguished guests, Dr. Bedross Der Matossian and Dr. Barlow Der Mugrdechian. Thank you for being here and for the work you do to educate and preserve history. Events like this are not just about remembrance. They're about responsibility. Responsibility to learn, to share, and to ensure that lessons of the past continue to shape a more just and aware future. We are proud to be part of this community and this partnership, and more importantly, we are committed not just to participating, but to helping expand it, to reach more people, engaging more voices, and strengthening the impact of this important work. We were fortunate to have received a couple of proclamations in recognition of this week and its significance. At this time, I would like to read a proclamation issued by Governor Katie Hobbs. Beginning April 24, 1915, the Armenian people suffered a genocide of great proportion involving the loss of over 1.5 million lives, and Armenians have throughout their history suffered needless losses of their population that have bordered on near annihilation of an entire race, twice having suffered at the hands of conquerors and driven from their homelands. And those who survived have continued to hope for a world free of desire to destroy a single race of people. And traditional to the Armenian custom, April 24th has been designated as Armenian Genocide Day to remember such losses. And it is appropriate for the citizens of Arizona to join in this commemoration, to rededicate themselves to the principle of equal justice of all people, and to remember the atrocities committed against this race so that such horrors are never repeated. Signed, I, Katie Hobbs, Governor of the State of Arizona, do hereby proclaim April 24, 2026 as Armenian Genocide Remembrance Day. Dr. Langell, it is my honor to present this proclamation to you in recognition of your leadership and importance of this week. Thank you. Thank you for all your hard work. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. And I'm Professor Barlow Der Matossian of the Armenian Studies program at Fresno State. And I also would like to thank the Jewish Studies program and Dr. Tim Langell for organizing the Genocide Awareness Week. I also would like to thank St. Apgar Armenian Church a little bit about the history just with me is that I've been involved in Genocide Awareness Week from its first beginning, almost 13 years ago, I believe now. And as the head of the Armenian Studies program at Fresno State, that we are also happy to be a co-sponsor of Genocide Awareness Week and also for this panel today. And I'm very happy to be here with my honored colleague and friend, Dr. Bedross Der Matossian. My presentation today is going to focus on the question of authoritarianism and the Armenian genocide and the ethnic cleansing of Artsakh. And I intend to give you an overview of how the trend towards authoritarianism can possibly lead to genocide and ethnic cleansing. And I'll use the example of the Armenian genocide, but I'm going to focus more on the issue of Artsakh and in that area. So a comparative look at the authoritarian perpetrators. There are many definitions for authoritarianism. I've only put a few of them up here. Again, one of them, the second one, is often used to denote a form of government that's not democratic. And then studies have demonstrated there's a great deal of variation in authoritarian rule. Generally speaking, authoritarian regimes concentrate power in their hands, and then using that power can lead to ultimately genocide or ethnic cleansing. It's that centralized power and that unfettered power and basically repressing any opposition. So I'd like to start with the Armenian genocide of 1915, which was initiated in the Ottoman Empire. Actually, the Ottoman Revolution of 1908 was in many ways a democratic revolution. It overthrew the power of the Tsar, of the Sultan, and led to a democratic election for a parliament, which in its first year was pretty democratic, but over the period of the 1909 to 1915, the Committee of Union and Progress became the most powerful element in the parliament. And after a coup d'etat in January of 1913, the CUP actually became a dictatorship. And at that point, we can say that it became an authoritarian regime. And then the Armenian genocide, which begins in early 1915 and continues through 1923. The CUP, the Committee of Union and Progress, utilizing the ideology of pan-Turkism, which became a motivating factor for the Armenian genocide, and also the fact that war or violence is often a cover for genocide, as we've seen in many examples in the 20th century. This map is kind of hard to see and probably on this area, but it's a map intended to show you the concentration of Armenian population in both the Russian Empire and the Ottoman Empire in 1914 prior to World War I. So this is the border, and then this would be the Ottoman Empire Armenians, and this would be the Russian Empire Armenians. The key basically says that there were approximately 4.5 million Armenians living in the two empires. Approximately 45% of Armenians lived in the Ottoman Empire and 45% in the Russian Empire. But then when we look at the map in 1926 and take a look at the Ottoman Empire, it's down to 5% of the Armenians, because this is taken after the Armenian genocide of 1915, where more than 1.5 million Armenians were killed. Many were deported, exiled, survivors left. Today, those lands are left without any Armenians. So again, my connection is that the authoritarian regime of the CUP led pretty much directly to the Armenian genocide. But today I want to focus more on the case of Azerbaijan and the case of Artsakh, which is also called Karabakh. And let's start with a look at the modern Republic of Azerbaijan, which was established in August of 1991. It's had 4 presidents. But since 2003, the regime has changed into more of an authoritarian regime through constitutional change, where presidential term limits have now been removed, so that the current president of Azerbaijan is eligible to run in perpetuity as president. So there is no basic constriction to his power. Elections were held in 2008, 2013, 2018, but basically now it's a single leader authoritarian regime. And there are quite a few outside organizations. Freedom House, for example, does reports on various countries and gives them ratings. If you see here, it's rated as not free. It is Azerbaijan. Political rights, 0 out of 40. Civil liberties, 6 out of 60. For comparison, the country of Armenia was reported as 54 out of 100. The United States is somewhere in the mid-80s as of a couple of years ago. So it gives you a range to understand the descent of Azerbaijan into authoritarianism, ranked 167th out of 180 countries in the world as far as press freedom. And again, one of the hallmarks of authoritarianism is to eliminate any opposition, especially a free press. So this is one of the ways in which they cement their power. So the regime has overseen an extensive crackdown in civil liberties in recent years. In 2014, President Aliyev destroyed any semblance of pluralism by waging really a pretty strong war against any remaining critics who have been either jailed or exiled. And in 2017, he even appointed his wife as vice president. So today, the vice president of Azerbaijan is the wife of the president. And it's very important also to simply listen to the words of an authoritarian leader, because the words themselves tell you a lot about what is the potential. So let's read some of the words that are quoted about President Aliyev. The first one: Yerevan is our historic land, and we Azerbaijanis must return to these Azerbaijani lands, he said in a speech in 2018. This is our political and strategic goal. By the way, this is not an old statement. He's repeated it recently many times. He calls Armenia Western Azerbaijan, and that is setting for him the framework for further military action. Number two, Aliyev's discourse regarding what he calls historic Azerbaijan includes, as I mentioned, he says Western and Eastern Azerbaijan. And during the two decades of his reign, he continues to call today the Republic of Armenia a recognized country. He calls it Western Azerbaijan. So he's basically telling his people that this is a reason for us to, at someday, go to war. As far as Eastern Azerbaijan, that would be the area of Artsakh or Karabakh. And then finally, number three, he says, Western Azerbaijan, Armenia, is our historic land. And this is confirmed by many historical documents, historical maps, and our history. This is exactly contrary to history because, as I will demonstrate, Artsakh is historically Armenian land, and then we'll take it up to the modern. So rhetoric is an important precursor in the authoritarian regimes as they move towards violence. And then we get into the money laundering, and this is important, I think, as well, because this is called the Azerbaijani laundromat. It's kind of a euphemism. It was a complex money laundering scheme by which Azerbaijan basically was bribing Western politicians, Western meaning European politicians, and also companies, in order to, again, suppress any dissent or any criticism of the policies of Azerbaijan. So can you imagine you're paying politicians in Europe to defend the policies of Azerbaijan? This is basically corruption at its worst. And you can see that this was up to $2.9 billion, but it's much more than that. So this is another aspect of the authoritarian regime. Let's do a little bit of history about Artsakh, because today I'm going to be talking about the ethnic cleansing of Artsakh, which will mean that ultimately by 2023 there will be no Armenians left in Artsakh. We just talked about the history according to President Aliyev, but these are maps which are coming from earlier in history, some several thousand years ago, where Artsakh is considered to be part of historic Armenia, one of the provinces of historic Armenia. This is not just an Armenian map. These are maps by Armenia's neighbors, the Greeks and the Persians, who mentioned these terms in their maps back 2,000 years ago. We're going to jump ahead because there's not time to go into the whole history of Artsakh, but by the time we get to the 18th century, 19th century, most of the Caucasus, all of the Caucasus, was conquered by the Russian Empire in 1828. They completed the conquest of the Caucasus, which meant that all of Artsakh came also into the Russian Empire. And therefore, then we get into the 20th century, and beginning in the 1900s, when Armenia declared its independence on May 28th, Azerbaijan also declared its independence. This was all as a result of the Russian Revolution and the collapse of the Russian Empire. And then if you look at the population statistics, 95% of the population of Artsakh was Armenian in this period. 95% Armenian in this period. A lot of things to read, but one thing important here in this is the important decision of where to allocate or where to place the region of Karabakh in respect to the Soviet republics. And in 1920, the Communist Party decided that Karabakh, Artsakh should remain within the Armenian Soviet Socialist Republic. But Stalin reversed that decision, and he reversed it in 1921, and he put the area of Karabakh, which was almost entirely Armenian, into the political jurisdiction of Karabakh, which would lead to, of course, later problems. This is the population map. This is according to Soviet census of 1926. Approximately 125,000 Armenians in Artsakh, 89% Armenian, less than 10% Azeri. The rest of this, again, I'm not going to read all of it, and I would share this with anybody that would like to read about it. This is simply showing that even from its inception in 1921, when Artsakh was placed within the jurisdiction of Karabakh, that already Armenians were being discriminated against. Their lands were being, cultural monuments and Armenian heritage monuments were already being destroyed. And there was the suppression of socioeconomic development in Artsakh, leading to Armenians already by the 1960s writing petitions to the Soviet government asking to be taken out of the jurisdiction of the Soviet Republic of Azerbaijan and to be moved into the Soviet Republic of Armenia. And in 1964, there was a major petition, but also in 45, 65, 67, 77. This is documentation that the policies of the Soviet Azerbaijan Republic, even in that time, was already discriminating against the Armenians, making it into the fact that many Armenians had to leave that area in order to find work or to find other ways to make a living. Then we jumped to the more modern era. We moved to what we call the Gorbachev era, which was considered to be a period of reform in the Soviet Union from 1985 until its dissolution. He opened up the doors to criticism using a policy of glasnost, which he said that now we can criticize people, we as the Soviet people, but you had to go back in history and talk about Soviet figures in the past. Well, Stalin was a very good figure to criticize. And in that period, 75,000 Armenians from Nagorno-Karabakh signed a petition addressed to Gorbachev requesting that Artsakh Karabakh be reunited with Armenia. And I want to mention one important legal fact, that the status of Artsakh Karabakh within the Soviet Union was a semi-autonomous, they call it an oblast, which is a region, which had its own rights. One right was to request for the movement of its jurisdiction from one Soviet state to the other. That's a legal document, which means that they are asking for that, right? They're just asking in a petition to be placed in a different area for all the reasons that I mentioned to you earlier. Again, the timeline is extensive here, and I'm not going to read anything again, except to say again, another petition in November of 1987, this time 80,000 signatures. So we can really begin to see that this is the beginning of the Artsakh popular movement, 1987, 1988. Totally peaceful. There's no violence, there's nothing. The people are simply asking for what is allowed to them by Soviet law. And again, just jumping through 1988, 1991. 1991 was an important year because they held a referendum. So we have something in international law known as the there's two differing concepts, and one is the fact that if you are a group of people, that you should have the right to decide who rules over you. Kind of sound like our colonists many years ago that wanted to decide who should rule over us. So a referendum is considered to be an internationally accepted way of doing so, and you can see that 82% of the population, the turnout was 82%, and 99% of the population of Artsakh wanted to move from Azerbaijan to Armenia. Now, I want to show you some slides. Actually, I happened to be in Armenia in June of 1988, and these are slides that I took almost 40 years ago, more than 40 years ago. This is actually the movement as it developed in Armenia. So that movement, Artsakh movement, went also from Artsakh to Yerevan, the capital. It was students who were leaders of the movement. These are Armenian university students who left school to go out and to publicly call for the movement of Artsakh to Armenia. This is a map which shows in Armenian, it says the reunification of Artsakh, this is Artsakh with Armenia, is completely within the Leninist national policy. They're trying to justify it within the context of Soviet policy. And it's saying, as I mentioned to you, that it's legal to change your jurisdiction. This is an interesting series of just, handmade posters, but they're comparing 1915 and 1988. 1988 is the pogroms also that took place in Sumgait against Armenians. This one has, you can't see it very well, but it shows Stalin and it shows, again, the Armenian genocide. And then the movement in Armenia mushroomed to over 500,000 Armenians. And I was here in the middle of this crowd, 500,000 Armenians. They called them the meetings, and basically this was calling for the reunification of Armenians in Artsakh with the Republic of Armenia. Look at this is the main Opera Square. Literally the entire country was shut down. I happened to be there with a group of students from Fresno State. I really wasn't aware of what was going on. Literally when I was in the country, all further entry into the country was prohibited. So the Soviet Union basically shut down Armenia, and I happened to be in the middle of it. Didn't really know it until afterwards, right? Because you don't know what's going on. But I wanted to show you to the extent to which the Armenian people adopted this concept of reunifying the Armenians, justifiably, in my opinion, back with the Republic of Armenia. And this is that law of secession that I talked to you about, the legal justification for that request and the referendums. Now let's talk about, and this is the kind of the last part that I'll be talking about today, which is the part which leads to the ethnic cleansing of the Armenians of Artsakh. So there are 3 phases to that. Phase 1 was the first Artsakh War, which broke out in 1991 and lasted until 1994. These are some points in it. In this first war, the Armenians of Artsakh were victorious. It did not end with a permanent peace treaty. It ended only with a ceasefire in 1994. And unfortunately, that ceasefire, that frozen status lasted until 2020. So there was not an ability of political mechanisms to solve the Karabakh problem, even though it was supposed to be done through the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, and also through what's called the Minsk process. So the Minsk process was bringing together countries to help mediate between Armenia, Azerbaijan, and the Armenians of Artsakh. Okay? So we're going to jump from 1994 now, because nothing is going to be done in the interim period, now to what's called the 44-day war of September 27th to November 9th. This time, the Republic of Azerbaijan initiated a military operation or war in which they seized most of Artsakh, at least a third to begin with. They were supported by the Republic of Turkey, and very clearly in terms of organization of the campaign, that is the military campaign, and in terms of military equipment. And take a look at what President Erdogan of Turkey said in 2024 during a speech to his own military. He says, in Azerbaijan's Karabakh, together with our Azerbaijan brothers, we completely eliminated the enemy force. What's really ironic about this is that the Republic of Azerbaijan doesn't like that statement whatsoever, because they don't want Turkey to take any credit for what happened in this instance. But this is very clear indication that the Republic of Turkey was working with the Republic of Azerbaijan towards the ultimate ethnic cleansing of Armenia, which would be a second genocide. This is showing you that after the 2020 war, what was taken over, the only land connection left to Artsakh was through the Lachin corridor. But I also want to show you the cultural damages, because I talked to you about that back in the 1920s and 1930s. This is the major cathedral called Gazanchetsotz, which is the major cathedral built in the 19th century in the city of Shushi as it existed. And then in October 2020, it was targeted by missiles by the Azeris. Look at the hole in the roof, and then take a look at the inside of it. Damaged in a missile attack by Azerbaijan, but it gets worse. This is the same church, which is now ostensibly undergoing reconstruction. What's taken place? You can see that the dome has been taken apart, and now probably Azerbaijan is going to convert this into what they call a Caucasian Albanian church, or maybe into a mosque. It's not clear what's happening, but take a look at this church. I visited this church in 2019. I have extensive photographs from it. It's called the Ganach Church. Ganach means green. It's named after St. John the Baptist, which was built in 1847. This is how it existed before. Today, satellite photos indicate it's been completely leveled. Heritage Watch, which is in Cornell University, is documenting the systematic destruction of Armenian monuments today. And this is not even now today. I'm going to show you today. On the left is the Church of St. Hagop. Hagop is Jacob. It's a church which was built in, not an old church in 2005, but it was reported just this month that it was completely destroyed, completely razed to the ground. This indicates that the policy of the authoritarian regime is not changing. The policy is to eliminate any Armenian presence in Artsakh in order to justify their ethnic cleansing of that region. And then finally, the last step in the ethnic cleansing begins in December of 2022 with the Azeri blockade of that single lifeline from Armenia to Artsakh. More than 120,000 Armenians for over 6 months were deprived of food, fuel, and medical attention. Humanitarian impact, severe food shortages, rationing, infrastructure disruption. So this lasted from December of 2022 until September of 2023, when the final phase of the ethnic cleansing took place, when Azeri forces launched an offensive against a weakened Artsakh and ultimately forced the entire depopulation of the remaining Armenians in Artsakh. More than 120,000 Armenians in 3 days left Artsakh to go to freedom and safety in the Republic of Armenia. Organizations like Freedom House and the European Parliament characterize the action as ethnic cleansing, so it's not my words, it's their words, due to the calculated nature of the blockade and military pressure intended to make the region uninhabitable to Armenians. And the final kind of straw in this is Armenian political prisoners. So today, the Republic of Azerbaijan has arrested many of the top-ranking former officials in Artsakh, subjected them to a sham criminal trial, and has now sentenced most of them to life imprisonment. These include the former presidents of Artsakh, military officials, etc. And pretty much everyone that's followed it and reported on it, I'm talking about non-Armenian sources, has basically reported on the idea that this was not a fair trial. So this is still going on in Armenia. There are political prisoners in Azerbaijan that have been condemned to life imprisonment for no more reason than they lived in Artsakh. And finally, my last slide is simply to show us that when we talked about the authoritarian regimes, and really I was comparing Turkey in 1915 with Azerbaijan today, we can see that the concentration of power, the suppression of dissent, the control of propaganda, and the use of state machinery can ultimately lead to very violent acts, those that we today call genocide and ethnic cleansing. And I believe that that connection is very clear, that it was that first step. And that's the first step that we always have to be aware of, that countries today that move towards authoritarianism, it's not inevitable, but it is a good first warning that the next step could be towards ethnic cleansing or towards genocide. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Barlow, for that excellent presentation. And I'd like to thank the Arizona State University Jewish Studies program for organizing this fantastic event. Louder? All right. Do I have a microphone here? So I'd like to thank the Jewish Studies program here at Arizona State University, the Surp Apkar, St. Apkar Church, our Armenian community, Timothy Langley, and everyone who's involved in organizing this event. I think it's an important event to understand about the Holocaust and genocides in the course of history, but also about what has happened to Armenians in the past and the present, in order to take measures, preventive measures, so that Armenians do not see any more violence in the course of the future. So the theme today is the Armenian genocide and the ethnic cleansing of Artsakh. There are different approaches that try to connect them both together, that this is something that started from the 19th century and ended in the ethnic cleansing of Artsakh. I'm a historian, also historian of genocide, but also I argue that I do not believe in the continuum approach. The continuum approach argues that the Armenian genocide, the roots goes back to the late 19th century, and it culminated in the Armenian genocide and still going on today. But my argument here would be that academically, I think there are connections between what happened in the past and what's happened in the past, meaning in the 19th century, Armenian genocide, the Hamidian massacres, the Adana massacres, and also what happened in Nagorno-Karabakh. And there are three themes, I argue, that are connecting these four phases of violence, which is lack of humanitarian intervention or humanitarian intervention, apathy, and impunity. So I'll start my lecture, since Barlow has covered everything. I'll start with 2020, September 27. During COVID-19 global pandemic, Azerbaijan, aided by Turkey and jihadist militants from North Syria, attacked the Republic of Artsakh. As you know, the war lasted 44 days. 4,000 to 5,000 Armenians lost their lives. 80% of the Armenians ended up as refugees in the Republic of Armenia, but then some returned back. Thousands actually returned back. And things got south. In September 2023, Azerbaijan initiated a military offensive against the Republic of Artsakh, which ended with the surrender of Artsakh and the disbandment of armed forces, and around 120,000 Armenians were ethnically cleansed from their historical homeland, leaving behind their houses, schools, universities, museums, churches, cathedrals, and even the cemeteries of the fallen heroes from the two wars. The international media has been biased and still is biased, and demonstrated an apathy towards the plight of Armenians of Artsakh, unlike the case of Kosovo, for example, whose self-determination and unilateral declaration of independence from Serbia on February 17, 2008 was supported by significant segment of the international community. The press, in the case of the ethnic cleansing of Artsakh, was tainted with both sidism and did not even condemn the Azerbaijani aggression. The reluctance of the international community to hold Azerbaijan responsible for its genocidal actions resulted in a climate of impunity. As mentioned earlier, impunity emboldens perpetrators to commit additional acts of violence and aggression by absolving them from responsibility and accountability. I'd like to mention here too that academic institutions around the globe and in the United States, be them journals and other institutions, have failed to raise their voice in order to bring attention to the plight for the Armenians. The only journal, I should say, that did a special issue was Genocide Studies International. And here we have two esteemed editors, Professor Alex Alvarez and Professor Henry Theriault. The only journal that organized special issue, even prior to the ethnic cleansing, during the blockade of Lachin, which was, for me, if you ask me, that's a genocide by attrition. And that's the journal was, thanks to also Greg Kurken-Sarkisian and Zoryan Institute. GSI is a Zoryan Institute-backed journal. This is the only journal that really raised the red flags that something worse is coming. No one listened. So, After exploring the historical absence of humanitarian intervention, the culture of impunity and consistent international difference, this lecture is going to focus on ethnic cleansing of Artsakh. But before I do that, I'd like to define what I mean by international apathy or lack of humanitarian intervention or impunity. So what is impunity? Impunity occurs when perpetrators of crimes such as crimes against humanity, war crimes, or genocide escape justice. In intergroup conflict, the perpetrator uses its power, international status, and tactics like denial, intimidation, diplomatic manipulation, as Barlow spoke about, laundromat and exploitation of bystanders in action to avoid punishment. The lack of accountability not only frees the perpetrator from responsibility, but also emboldens them to commit future violence, creating an ongoing cycle of harm without any disruption. Second, the humanitarianism. The concept of humanitarian intervention to prevent mass atrocities emerged in the early 19th century, primarily aimed at protecting vulnerable groups from violence. This idea predates the formal legal framework of intervention, humanitarian intervention. Historians such as Keith Otempo, Davide Rotogno, Michel Toussaint, and Charlie Lederman have explored the evolution of humanitarianism and the failure of humanitarian intervention in the 19th and early 20th century Ottoman Empire. The Armenian complex geopolitical position caught between Russia and the West hindered potential intervention by the great powers at the time of the three phases of violence that targeted the Armenians. The Hamidian massacres, 1894-96, the Adana massacres of 1909, and the Armenian Genocide. Humanitarianism back then was often subordinated to political calculations, making the Armenian cause a risky, quote-unquote, move for Western powers, as it's also in the case of Artsakh. As a result, they exploited the Armenian question for their own political and imperial interests, both internally and externally, rather than prioritizing genuine humanitarian action. What is apathy? Apathy is a lack of feeling, emotion, interest, or concern about something. It is a state of indifference or suppressing emotions such as concern and passion. An apathetic individual lacks interest in or concern about emotional, social, spiritual, philosophical, virtual, or physical life and the world. I'm more interested here in bystander apathy, which occurs when, during an emergency, those standing by do nothing to help but instead stand by and watch. Sometimes this can be caused by one bystander observing other bystanders and imitating their behavior. If other people are not acting in a way that makes situations seem like an emergency that needs an attention, other bystanders will often act the same way. The diffusion to responsibility can also be to blame for bystander apathy. And so we see that during the three phases of violence targeted against the Armenian, the Hamidian massacres, the Adana massacres of 1909, and the Armenian genocide, the three themes include there was lack of humanitarian intervention, there was impunity because those who committed the Hamidian massacres, the Adana massacres, and the Armenian genocide enjoyed impunity. And as I said, impunity emboldens perpetrators to perpetrate more acts of violence. But one thing is different in the case, if we compare it in the case of Artsakh, that's apathy. All right? International coverage of the Armenian genocide, of the Hamidian massacres, of the Adana massacres was very dominant. Everyone knew what was happening. Everyone condemned their own governments. All the major newspapers, from New York Times to Omaha Bee, from Fresno Bee did exist at the time. Major newspapers covering the event and demonstrating the suffering and the massacres perpetrated against the Armenians. So, what's happening in the case of Artsakh when we examine these three themes? In previous historical phases of violence, two of the three key denominators, lack of humanitarian intervention and impunity, were present. However, in the case of the 2020 Artsakh war and its aftermath, all three denominators, lack of humanitarian intervention and humanitarianism, impunity and international apathy, were prominently visible. While humanitarian intervention was unlikely due to the region's complex geographical position, international legal constraints, and the influence of Russia, the other two factors, apathy and impunity, were starkly evident. From the outset, international media displayed bias and indifference towards the suffering of the Armenians of Artsakh. And we know how much money the government of Azerbaijan poured into European press, buying the press and diverting the opinion of the European society against the Armenians. The press often adopted a both sides approach and failed to condemn Azerbaijani aggression. The international community's reluctance to compel Azerbaijan to cease its attacks on Armenians of Artsakh and Armenia itself created a climate of impunity for the Azerbaijani aggressor. As outlined in this lecture, impunity encourages perpetrators to continue their violence by avoiding responsibility and accountability. Therefore, the ethnic cleansing of Artsakh resulted from the presence of the three key determinants: lack of intervention, impunity, and global apathy. It is important to note that no action was taken despite the clear signs of ethnic cleansing being evident, as that was demonstrated clearly in the Genocide Studies Intervention Journal during the Lachin corridor blockade. We're not prophets, but as genocide scholars, we can't predict, but we can see the determinants that are going to come. Now, in today's international system, the ongoing energy crisis caused by Russia's war in Ukraine, along with Azerbaijan's geostrategic significance, has led Western powers to adopt an ambivalent stance. The prioritization of oil and gas resources over human rights violation reveals a harsh reality. Energy interests seem to trump concerns about suffering of the 120,000 Armenians ethnically cleansed from their historical land. This echoes a troubling historical pattern in which a lack of humanitarian intervention, impunity, and international indifference are all too familiar. The Western powers' support for Azerbaijan's despotic regime, as Barlow has demonstrated, driven by oil interest, mirrors the historical scapegoat of Armenians by Western powers for their own imperial ambitions that happened in the 19th century, happened in the Hamidian massacres, happened in the Adana massacres, and happened in the Armenian genocide. To conclude, on April 18, 2023, in a televised speech, Azerbaijani President Ilham Aliyev stated, and I quote, "Armenians living in Karabakh should either accept Azerbaijani citizenship or find another place to live. There is complete freedom in that. All democratic fundamentals have been offered. This issue should be resolved on the basis of human rights." End quote. In this contradictory statement, Aliyev implied that ethnic cleansing was the only solution to the Karabakh issue, knowing full well that Armenians of Artsakh would never agree to live under a despotic regime that fosters Armenophobia and anti-Armenian sentiments. At the same time, he claimed that Armenian rights would be protected as citizens of Azerbaijan. This oxymoronic rhetoric reveals the deeply flawed and ideological underpinnings of Aliyev's stance. While the first part of Aliyev's statement issued an ultimatum to the Armenians of Artsakh, the second part promised peace and equal rights under Azerbaijani rule. However, as Barlow demonstrated too, Azerbaijan is ranked not free by Freedom House with a score of 9 out of 100, compared to Armenia's score 55. The country is plagued by severe human rights violations, including the persecution of political opponents, arbitrary arrests, torture, indefinite detentions, forced disappearance, and gender-based violence. This raises significant doubt that Armenians of Artsakh could have lived peacefully or prospered under Aliyev's regime. If Azerbaijan was Switzerland, I would say, let's go for it. But the Nagorno-Karabakh issue wouldn't have come up if Azerbaijan was Switzerland. A year before the ethnic cleansing in Artsakh, I warned that without strong action from the United Nations and Security Council, such as sanctions on Azerbaijan and the threat of force, the situation would spiral out of control, leading to two possible outcomes: minimal ethnic cleansing or maximal genocide by attrition. The ethnic cleansing of Armenians of Artsakh and the ongoing cultural genocide represents a tragic culmination of three key determinants outlined in this context: impunity, lack of humanitarian intervention, and international apathy. These factors have converged to create a perilous situation for the Armenians of Artsakh, marking a devastating continuation of centuries-old cycle of violence and displacement. Few words, and I'll finalize. Under Nikol Pashinyan's government, the current government actively discourages Armenians from addressing the issue of the ethnic cleansing of Artsakh, treating such discussion as incompatible with state foreign policy, and in some cases characterizing them as incitement, as it happened recently with my dear colleague, Dr. Edita Gzoyan, the director of the Armenian Genocide Museum Institute, who was fired for giving a book to J.D. Vance, our vice president, on our Azerbaijani aggression, as reported in the American press. Right? This approach raises concerns that official policy may foster in Armenia a climate of fear and intimidation, particularly among scholars, researchers, and public intellectuals who engage with the subject. Critics argue that such an environment risks constraining open academic inquiry and public debate, potentially leading to self-censorship and the narrowing of discourse on matters of historical memory and national significance on the expense of satisfying both neighbors, Turkey and Azerbaijan. Thank you very much.
We have quite a bit of time actually for questions, and it's great to have a full room. Again, thank you to the Armenian community for showing up and students as well. Love it. Did you two want to have any exchange about your papers before we turn to the audience in person and online?
Audience, I'd like to.
You like the audience?
Yeah.
So thank you both for what were both very insightful, but also very comprehensive.
Exciting, you mean?
No, not exciting. Yeah. Well, we'll see what happens after this. Insightful, but also very comprehensive, I think, treatments. You covered a lot of different factors that I think allow us to see the complexity of what's happening and some of the nuances. I had a number of questions, and in one sense, I think they're to both of you, although two of them sort of pick up on particular things Bedross addressed. So following up the issue of what Armenia is doing now, which seems not very effective for the long-term viability even of Armenia, let alone return of Artsakh, what recommendation or recommendations would you make to Armenia right now? Like, what's a path that could be productive? Second question is,
Henry?
Oh, what's that?
Path for what?
Towards some positive outcome, better outcome than the trajectory we're seeing right now, which looks pretty bleak, I think, from external observation. Second question is, could you comment a little bit more specifically on the internal mechanisms of Azerbaijan that have sort of fostered anti-Armenianism and how deep that runs, whether it's more of a surface propaganda or something that's very embedded in the society? And then the last question, and that's of course to both of you, the last question is, if you talked a lot about indifference in the press, and Barlow talked a lot about the kind of attitudes in Azerbaijan and so forth. I was wondering if we look at 4 cases right now, 2 I would consider accomplished genocides, Gaza and Artsakh, and 2 ongoing, Uyghurs and Sudan, the latest Sudan genocide. They are all very different in terms of the geopolitics around media attention. And I was wondering if you could comment on that. Does that make a difference ultimately? There's no intervention of any substance happening for any of them. Is there some media approach that would cover all of them? Is there a general problem in the media, or are there particular problems in each case that don't apply to the other cases?
So the first question about what Armenia can do. Can you hear me, Henry? Okay. Armenia the current government doesn't want to deal with the Artsakh issue. It's a taboo now. They want to win the elections. That's the most important, by satisfying their neighbors. I think the ultimate solution would be the right to return of Armenians of Artsakh to Artsakh, guaranteed under international monitoring, guaranteed by international guarantors, let's say. That's the first. The second was about.
And this for both of you, the sort of internal mechanisms in Azerbaijan that have produced
the
anti-Armenianism, and how deep it is.
Here's the thing.
Propaganda from the top.
Any authoritarian regime needs to have a cause to survive. For Aliyev's regime, the cause are the Armenians. So as much as he promotes Armenophobia, it strengthens his regime. So that's why the war on Artsakh was a major factor in order to strengthen his regime, because if it was a democratic country, a war wouldn't have taken place, all right? And the last question about the genocide in Gaza and Uyghur, etc. All of you know that there was a major issue in the Armenian culture about the land being. And of course, Armenians are responsible for that. It wasn't, the land wasn't confiscated. The only reason I'm telling you is that land issue was covered more by international press than the ethnic cleansing of Artsakh. After all, who cares about Armenians in the Caucasus first? And because it does not serve the interest of the international power, Armenia doesn't have anything to give, neither oil nor gold or anything, all right? So who cares about Armenians? And there's more contempt. And of course, Darfur and Uyghurs are, you can't get information because it's under China. The same with Sudan. The way that Sudan's genocide is being explored, kind of studied, is through satellite images. I mean, yesterday I was giving a talk. There was a person from the Shoah Foundation at USC. She was showing the amount of recordings that they had. Survivors of the Holocaust, 58,000 interviews. Survivors, the second largest collection is the Armenian genocide, 1,300, Armenian Film Foundation. If you go to different genocides, Sudan has 11 interviews. That tells a lot.
Thank you. I just want to address the question of feelings in Azerbaijan, because I'm always very careful to distinguish between governments and people. So I feel that in the case of Azerbaijan, if we just look at the history of it, I think there were actually, people probably are not aware of it, there were over 500,000 Armenians living in Azerbaijan before all of these wars broke out, or the Karabakh issue. So I see that, as Bedross very clearly said, that authoritarian regimes use internal enemies to strengthen their own regime. So definitely I see a pathway out if it changes. And the other factor in that is that there are so many outspoken opponents, Azeris themselves, who have gotten in trouble, are in prison, who speak very eloquently against all of that. They want to see their country move towards democratization as well. I see the same thing in Turkey as well, actually. So in most places, if you can move towards democratization, you're going to lead to a better result in terms of what's going on. Regarding the press, I don't have much to say, but just an observation that I see is that the press has a very short attention span. So we see that there's a crisis, and then that crisis has disappeared in the press. And I attribute it to maybe one thing that we don't think about is the concentration of corporate power in media. That is, the number of media outlets is being progressively controlled by fewer and fewer people. So maybe 5 or 6 important corporations or wealthy people control an inordinate amount of the press, which coordinates often with the government. And especially when, and using the United States as an example, when the United States wants to attack or go to war or do something, they first set the precursors, right? It's in the press. We start talking about it, and then it takes place, which we can see again happening in the United States on a different thing. So it's unfortunate, but I think that was a great point that he made, Bedross made, about the indifference or the apathy in the press, but I think it has multiple background to it.
Just one example, British Petroleum interest in Azerbaijan, SOCAR too, and there was a time I would call the BBC as the BPC, British Petroleum Corporation. Yeah, that tells a lot.
Thank you guys for being.
What's your name?
My name is Juliana
Juliana.
Panosian. Thank you guys for being here. I wanted to sort of ask a maybe more like politically ended question. So in regards to like the UN and sanctions and everything, obviously the US is on the Security Council, veto powers, whatnot, and Armenia having like close ties historically with Russia as like one of our biggest allies, that sort of obviously like weakens.
Past tense.
Yeah. Yes, in the past. Like that sort of weakened things, especially with like a lot of US allies being like, there's proof of like funding on like them funding like Azerbaijan with like weapons and money. Do you like foresee a future now that we're sort of severed from Russia and there's like a Armenian push to be in the EU or like to be closer with the US or raising their own infrastructure? Do you see like a future where Armenia could be in a stronger state politically? We are able to tie ourselves closer to the West rather than to like Russia or Iran?
Yeah. I mean, history has taught us that it's the same in the course of history, relying on the West is using Armenia. The West has used Armenia to achieve its goals, you know. It's kind of trying to bring Armenia to its clout. You can't do that in a neighborhood where you have Russia too, you know. So it's I'm very pessimist about the policy of the current government regarding you know, you can't play both sides. It will be very difficult, specifically when you don't have anything to offer, all right? And your two allies are Iran and Russia. I know we know there's a situation in Russia now, and Putin, it's not a democratic country where, and sometimes the whole idea of democracy, okay, Armenia became a democracy and expected that the West would support it during the Artsakh, ethnic cleansing of Artsakh. No one showed up. They're not interested about democratic values. West is not interested about democratic values. They're interested about promoting their own interest in the region, even scapegoating other nations and people for their own interest. And this whole idea of the TRIP project, the Trump bridge connecting Nakhichevan to Azerbaijan through Armenia, I think it's if you ask me, it's a joke. Some people would disagree with that.
I just would add that, again, Armenia is in a difficult political situation. And again, the prime minister needs to navigate that with trying to move closer to the West, but it's a very dangerous game. And as I think Bedross pointed out, Armenia's, I think, historically been disappointed by most of its friends, whether it's the Russian Empire, Russia, Soviet Union, West. So I'm not overly optimistic. And I don't really have a pathway in myself because I'm not in that predicting the future. But I think it's a very difficult path. So I think, you know, I mean, Bedross mentioned that the Armenians of Artsakh should have a right to return with international guarantees. I don't know of almost any example of where international guarantees have actually meant their weight in the sense of preventing anything. In fact, I think, and I could be wrong, of course, but I think anywhere the United Nations has kind of gotten involved in, it's ultimately just led to the other outcome. So again, I'm kind of pessimistic about that. Yes, France speaks. I was just talking. I have a history class, so I was just talking this morning. We were in. I'm doing it Zoom with Fresno State, so we were talking about World War I and just the immediate post-war period when the peace treaties were being developed. And the Armenians did exactly the same thing. They depended on the pronouncements of the West. Clemenceau, the Armenians' cause is my cause. You had David Lloyd George, Armenians should never live under the blasted tyranny of the Turks. And so what did Armenia do? They asked for the maximum Armenia, and then the facts on the ground had changed, and nationalist Turks had become strong, and the Treaty of Sèvres, Wilsoni Armenia, never came in. So,
Any other questions in the room?
I'm confused. I don't know how the Armenians were transported to Azerbaijan. And what, number two, I don't understand what is the ground legally that Armenians claim not property that they occupied for centuries, whatever, they claim it's theirs in a foreign country.
Armenia, yeah, just to clarify your confusion here, Armenians were historically present in the region. They did not go there. They're historically present in the region.
They left their own motherland.
Where is the motherland?
The motherland is Yerevan, Armenia.
No, there is historic Armenia. There is Armenia Major, Armenia Minor, but Armenians were present there for centuries in Artsakh.
In a foreign country.
There weren't foreign countries at the time. They were khanates. It's a different system. There were empires.
Yeah,
I mean,
before the modern country.
like would be the Armenians went to Iran, the western, northern west of Iran, and they are there for centuries, and they claimed the Muslim country, which Shah was very good, and they said, well, this is our land. This is, I don't
Armenians did not
understand
go
the
to Iran. Shah Abbas brought them by force to New Julfa after destroying the old Julfa.
Sure, it was the Turks too. I did the research, and it wasn't only the father Reza Shah, the Kabir. It was the Turks also before that. So it's a little bit different. But I still don't understand how the Armenians went to Azerbaijan and for so many decades and centuries, and they claim.
Here's the thing: there was no Azerbaijan back then. There is northern Azerbaijan in Iran, but it wasn't called Azerbaijan. Wasn't called Azerbaijan. It was different collection of khanates, and of course, it doesn't mean that I'm denying the existence of Azeri population. They existed. They had cultures and identities. But the creation of Azerbaijan is a modern state, is a modern phenomenon. The same way that Armenia emerged as a modern state, that's a modern phenomenon, because at the end of the day, Armenians were concentrated in Tbilisi, not Yerevan. And after the creation of 1918, the three republics, that's the emergence of modern Southern Caucasus, the republics of Caucasus. But you cannot say they went to a country and it's not theirs, etc. Historically, they were present there. Historically, also Azerbaijani or whatever they were called before that, they were present there too. Different identities, different principalities. The idea of nation did not exist back then. Nation is a byproduct of modern thinking, all right? So I'm sure you've done your research. I've done my research too, so.
Okay, the next question is from someone who's listening and participating on Zoom. Ella Tracy asks, when discussing the financial aspects of genocide, both Azerbaijani laundromat and how yesterday we discussed the UAE's financial gain with the genocide in Sudan, what can the American consumer or citizens do in terms of boycotts, and what would be effective in deterring these genocides? Is that a test question?
Here's the thing. The Armenian lobbies here, Armenian National Committee of America, has been trying for years to block is it 907? 907 to prevent military aid to Azerbaijan, because that military aid actually helped Azerbaijan to strengthen itself militarily, all right? And Azerbaijan has been preparing for this war for 3 decades, buying weapons, UAVs from Israel and other countries, and Armenians were lagging behind in everything because the country was, was in corruption, I have to say. We have to also criticize the Armenian government. Never criticize a nation, criticize governments. I never criticized the Azerbaijani citizen. I criticized the authoritarian government, because then it would be, you are an anti-Azeri person, you're an Armenophobe, you're anti-Turkish, you're anti-Semite. So to criticize actions of government and the way in which that government promotes hate and bigotry of their own citizens against the targeted group. All right, and the way to do that is to raise awareness and lobby for it. And ANCA, or Armenian Assembly, I don't know if Armenian Assembly is doing it, but ANCA has been in the forefront trying to block the removal of the 907 bill.
This is just a comment because my ancestry was from Georgia, from Tbilisi. And I've heard from my family that there was a concentrated presence of Armenians in Georgia, as well as in Azerbaijan and in neighboring countries. The Armenians helped to develop the oil industry in Azerbaijan. They are well known for that. Alexander Mantashev is well known.
Yeah.
So, and my ancestry that came from Georgia, they refused to go to Iran. They bypassed Iran and came and settled in Mesopotamia, Iraq at that time, and helped to develop the industries of Iraq, the Armenians. Wherever the Armenians have been, including Iran, because historically Shah Abbas extended free loans to the Armenians. He was impressed by their business ability and innovation, and they improved the culture and improved the industries in Isfahan. And that's how the Armenians went to Iran, and they were brought actually by force to Iran, but they did contribute wherever they went. So Azerbaijan is not a new thing because the Armenians were there. As you saw the numbers, they were over 80% of the population. They lived there, that was their land. And another evidence of that is that they built big and historic cathedrals on that land. So their presence is very obvious.
I'd like to add one thing.
Yes.
It's very important to understand this, is that whatever we see conflict in the Caucasus or the South Caucasus starts exploding as a result of the Russian occupation in the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century. The ethnic conflicts that take place within the Caucasus is byproduct of two or three factors. One of them to do factor of class, economic competition. At the end of the day, Armenians were running, the Matossians were running Baku business, oil business, and they were running also, they were the leading merchants in Tbilisi. The mayor of Tiflis, Khadisian, was Armenian. And that created a lot of animosity by both the Georgians and the Azeris against the Armenians. So it's a class thing, economic competition. Then divide and conquer by the Russian Empire, second. And only third, I would say, the ethnic dimension of the ethnic national dimension would come into the scene at the end, but not at the front. Think about it: modernization, economic advancement, oil. All of these would end up creating tensions among the Muslim workers in Azerbaijan, for example. Muslim workers, that's how they were against the Armenian tycoons.
That's right.
All right. And that economic tension would take an ethnic dimension to it eventually. All right. So that's important to realize, that the economic modernization, industrialization is very important. I mean, and why that period? Because Russian industrialization began in the end of the 19th century. was a latecomer to the industrialization, and specifically in the Caucasus, industrialization was based on two important cities, Baku and Tbilisi. It's not Yerevan. Yerevan didn't have. Yerevan was a backward city, by the way.
That's right.
You know, it was Baku and Tbilisi, and Tbilisi were the Armenians were running the business, and that created a lot of animosity against them. And Baku, to a certain extent, the Azerbaijanis were exploited. The Muslim population were exploited by the major, not only Armenian, by the way. There are other British oil companies, Armenian oil companies, the Mantasian, as you mentioned, Mantashur. No one knows that, you know, he wasn't alone. There were other major oil tycoons in Baku who actually wanted to make profit. It created a class tension between proletarian, between working class and the business class. So that's important too. Yeah.
And I have a follow-up question about awareness in media, right? Because this isn't the only issue where people aren't satisfied with media, right? More people are actually pivoting away from mainstream media into independent media, especially for certain topics. You know, whether it's domestic politics, Gaza, conflict in Iran. Is there independent media you suggest for people, like, where they can be informed about this? Like, because these lapses in our mainstream media, a lot of independent media is picking it up. And I was wondering if there's anywhere you suggest that covers this well, where people can be informed.
I mean, in terms of Gaza, in terms of Gaza, for example, if you want internal media, go to Haaretz newspaper.
Yeah.
It's one of the most prominent newspapers, Israeli newspapers, leftist, I should say, very strong. And there's, I mean, we tend not to see this, but there's a lot of opposition against the war, against genocide by Israeli left. The voices are stifled because you have a right-wing government in power. You have two major right-wing ultra-nationalist ministers, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. And so the voices of these people are stifled. I listen to Hebrew, I listen to Israeli news in Hebrew. I'm fluent in Hebrew. I listen to it every day. Every day I listen to it. So there are voices there. Azerbaijan, you don't have voice, of course.
That's what I'm looking for Nagorno-Karabakh.
Armenia, you have the alternative media, CivilNet, the EVN report, some other, non-profit actually. You can't follow the Armenian official news channels because that's propaganda itself. Turkey, you have also some leftist thing. But again, I mean, the importance for me is not within these countries, is how the international press covers these topics.
Yeah.
And you have a lot of biases against Armenia to that extent.
Yeah.
It's due to the economic benefits that these European countries get from Azerbaijan.
Because you really don't hear about these issues in any media. Like, I don't see it in the BBC, especially domestically here.
No.
I watch CBC News in Canada all the time, and
again, I'm telling you, the garden problem in the Armenian quarter of Jerusalem, which I'm involved and I know details about it, got more coverage rather than ethnic cleansing of Artsakh because it's in Jerusalem. Had that been in Somalia, and who cares? I'm not kidding. Who cares? I'm not belittling Somalia, but that's the perception of the West. The more you go to Africa, the less important is to cover these news. There are major problems in genocide still continues in Darfur, in Nigeria.
Yeah,
in Congo, in
DRC. Yeah, people aren't covering that.
Yeah, so people don't care about it. If it's not Europe or we're not benefiting out of it, who cares about it?
And that was the thing with the follow-up question from online, was because our wonderful speaker yesterday, Tartil Ali Imam, she gave a fantastic presentation and is going to share a bunch of resources, how people can be more informed and, support Sudanese people on the ground level. And so following up with that online question, like what we could do for Artsakh and as well, just for being informed.
Enlightened education and enlightened. Unfortunately, we cannot control newspapers here. You have to be very, very rich to donate to a newspaper, and that's how it works. I mean, we tend to think about alternative media, but again, to what extent alternative media has impact on the general public, right? That's very important. Unless the government's interest is to promote it, all right? US was not interested. And, here's the mentality of Armenians in Armenia. They thought that just because they became democratic countries, their status was elevated, and now they were going to be backed by all the European countries in the crisis in Artsakh. No one showed up. Well, similarly, in the case of Cilicia, as Barlow mentioned, 1922, immediately, and my grandmother, we are from Marash, and my grandmother says that at night, they escaped at night. The French soldiers put cloth under the legs of feet of the horses, and just escaped at night, leaving us, just take care of yourself, guys, Good luck.
Well, on that note, thank you.
Thank you
we
very
got our
much,
next session at
Thank
2:30. Thank you to our speakers. Thank you, Barlow, Bedross, and again for the community showing up, the students, and it's great having a full room. And we can continue the conversation over some caffeine and hydration and take it outside. So 15 minutes. We'll be back around 2:30. Thank you.